So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Terrel Rhodes. And for those of us in the ePortfolio community, when we think about the Association of American Colleges and Universities, or AAC&U, what comes to mind is the value rubrics as well as the annual ePortfolio Forum. Both are celebrating their 10th anniversary, and both would not be doing so had it not been for the leadership and the vision of Dr. Terrel Rhodes, Vice President in the Office of Quality, Curriculum, and Assessment, and also Executive Director of Value at AAC&U. And again, value stands for the valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education. It's really been a foundational sort of resource for those of us interested in exploring, how would you measure or how would you evaluate some of the essential learning outcomes that AAC&U has promoted around liberal education, of course, including integrative learning, critical thinking, problem solving, all of those things. Now, Terry's journey with portfolios actually began much earlier. I can't say whether he created a capstone portfolio as he finished his undergraduate years at IU Bloomington, or if he thought about putting together a professional portfolio as he was completing his master's and PhD in political science at UNC Chapel Hill. His long-standing academic career took him to UNC Charlotte, where he served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Programs and Special Assistant to the Provost for Assessment, and was a good colleague and friend of Kathleen Yancey. So Terry's ePortfolio adventures continued when he came out west to Portland State University. And there he was a professor of public administration and vice provost for curriculum and dean of undergraduate programs. I actually first met Terry in 2003 when both Stanford and Portland State were members of the first cohort of the International Coalition for ePortfolio Research that was led by Barbara Adair in Cambridge and Kathy. And then in that cohort was also Susan Kahn from IUPUI. And as Candace Reynolds will remember, we had many adventures traveling from Atlanta to Clemson and got lost and saw interesting things. Yeah, that's right, exactly. So I have fond memories of being a part of that International Coalition for ePortfolio Research. Now, but back to Terry. But since then, he has continued to write, speak, and advocate for ePortfolios, both in his work at AAC&U as well as a member of the ABLE board. Now, we started this conference on Tuesday with a compelling story that was shared both in song and word told by Latash Maurice Nahani. And we come full circle today with an elder from our own community. Terrel Rhodes has really been an I think it's reasonable. We go back a long time. So. Exactly. And I say that with the utmost respect as, as Paul Wasco. I think Paul Wasco said it first. We blame it on Paul. It's from University of Alaska Anchorage. We come full circle today, and Terry has really been an unfailing advocate for ePortfolios as an approach to recognize, strengthen, improve the education that we are designing for our students, continuing to innovate and fulfill the fundamental beliefs and ideals around evidence-based learning that were established by our founding president, ABLE's, founder, Trent Batson. So please join me in welcoming my good friend and colleague, Dr. Terrel Rhodes.
Thank you, Helen. And thank all of you for hanging out and staying the course here. I do apologize. Last year with the Batson lecture, I also had a plane issue and they changed my flight and I missed Susan's talk. And so Christina very wisely recorded it, so I was actually able to listen to hers. And I apologize again because I do have to run and get a cab and get out of here because there was a bit of a snafu. I think the common thread is me and flying, and so next time I'm going to walk or something to the meeting and make it okay. But I indeed want to thank ABLE. I was surprised at a meeting in January about an invitation to come and do this talk, and it has bothered me ever since then. because those of you who know me and how I usually do talks and presentations is that I usually start out with a set of slides. And off of that, I build what I want to say. And I virtually never write it down. And this was a lecture. And lectures have been sort of anathema to me for a long, long time. But I thought, well, I'm going to have to, a lecture means I'm going to write it down. And so I did. And now I'm going to read it to you, sort of. And so it's a grand experiment that has indeed made me nervous. But I am still going to start with some slides, because I just couldn't break my habit there. But then you're going to see they become quite scant in the talk. I also thank you, Helen, for looping back to the beginning. I did actually write this before I got here. And I've been very pleased that many of the threads were appearing in the things that others were doing, because we didn't collaborate, go figure, on what we were doing in our talks and in the sessions and stuff. And so what it means to me is that we are indeed, as a community, sharing so many fundamental values and approaches to the issues that we're dealing with here, and what has brought us together, while indeed instantiating those things in rather different ways and coming into them in very different ways. But the thanks to Helen for looping us back to the beginning and thinking about as a backdrop for this land, of acknowledging the early inhabitants of the land. And it's such a wonderful thing that is part of the culture here, is part of the culture in Australia. It is not part of the culture in the United States, at least in most of the states. Although in Alaska and Minnesota and tribal areas, you do find it on occasion. But there's no one in this room, I believe, and if you are one of these people, please let us know, because we want to know who you are, who created the land that we are on. I don't believe any of us in here have done that. But what all of us in here can indeed do is diminish it and destroy it. And it's kind of like what we are talking about and have been talking about here, is we have a great deal of power over the work that is going forward, and what the point of that is, and how we curate and preserve and move it forward. So I want to acknowledge Trent and Judy Batson for the work that they did in the early years of AAEEBL to actually allow it to be here. And again, my thanks to the board for inviting me to do this. The judgment about whether it was worth their while will remain with you in the end. I do have to run and flee right after this. Apologies for that. Please do email me and stuff afterwards. I'm fairly easy to find. And I will start with some slides and then move on. Okay. Last year, Susan Kahn's inaugural Batson lecture provided a detailed example of how one of the pioneering ePortfolio institutions managed the introduction and development of ePortfolios at IUPUI, and continues working to sustain and build ePortfolio usage and benefits. Today I'm going to focus more globally on ePortfolios and the work we are all engaged with. I want to engage you in thinking about why we encourage utilization of ePortfolios, what is the work we do, and how we've gotten to this point, and where you are in this landscape. The popular parlance, the popular conversation around why tends to center on the first job, the salary, what employers and employability is all about. That is the reason that students come to higher education. The why of liberal learning in the popular parlance. I'm going to show these few slides. You can't read them particularly well, but they're going to be available for you to peruse later. Some of you may have seen some of these, but it comes down to the employers. Our panel before this, parents, funders, individuals are interested in employment and employability. This slide is really the results of surveys that AAC&U does periodically. We have another one that will be coming out this fall, the most recent one, of what is it that they look for in our graduates. And what you find here is things like integrity, ethics, working together, giving back to communities, global cultures, okay? The kinds of things we have been talking about, but they're not the things that are related to that first job, that salary, etc. How long did it take you to get your job? When we ask employers about the variety of emerging educational practices that have potential to help them, that help prepare our students, again, it's the kind of engaged learning. It's what AAC&U and George Koo and others have talked about as high impact practices. What are they doing? And they're talking about is they're expecting students to work through ethical issues, hands-on experiences, skills to conduct research with their peers, internships, community-based field, on and on. It isn't a litany of courses. It isn't a litany of majors. It's abilities and skills that students need to have. The summary of some of these key findings, and I just highlighted some of the words here, is that they want things like innovation and what that means, to be able to take unscripted problems, etc., to do things across majors, that the skills across majors, the transferable skills, are more important than the student major. Now, all of these things happen within majors too, but the transferable skills are more important really than the major. The importance of a liberal education, i.e. what we have traditionally done in terms of arts and sciences. There's an art and a science to whatever it is we're doing, but also this application of the skills, not just that they have them, they got them, they took a course in them, but that they can use them. And indeed, they talk about ePortfolios. They still don't know exactly what to do with it, and we heard a lot of that conversation just most recently. Tony Carnevale from Georgetown Center for Labor in the Workforce has done a lot of work around that, the salary piece of this. And again, this is just a quick look at, the main thing is it goes from left and it moves up on the right. That's earnings. So as you move to the right, you're earning more money, regardless of the occupation that you're going into, regardless of what that occupation requires in terms of formal education. If you can have higher abilities in terms of the speaking, the originality, the judgment, decision-making, social skills, your earnings go up. When we asked employers around what is useful, I didn't print these slides out, and this is an odd way to read them. Electronic portfolios, student work. In terms of the recent graduate's resume and college transcript, would they look at something called a portfolio? Yes, we still have a lot of work to do with translating portfolio into something that intake people, talent advisors will look at. But there's a lot of interest in this, and so we should keep working on it to make it more meaningful. The concept of a liberal education. And again, that is part of that liberal education is the stuff that we talk about that is at the center of ePortfolio work. They want that kind of education. And no matter how much the conversation in the popular parlance is about the job and the first job and getting it quickly and getting a salary and paying off your debt, when you talk to employers about what kind of education do you want for your son, your daughter, they want this kind of education. They're talking about how it may not be necessary for others, but if it's necessary for their kids, okay? And that should tell us something about if it's good for mine, it should be good for all, and we need to keep that in our minds. And again, finally here, and I'm running through these quickly, but again, they'll be available, is around learning being integrative and problem-based. Again, you can read this, but it has to do with knowledge and experience. So knowledge is indeed a critical part of this. The portability and connectivity that ePortfolio is such a strength of ePortfolio. The well-structured knowledge as well as the ill-structured, okay? They want people to be able to deal with uncertainty. The routine and the transferable. Originally, that was written as the hard skills and the soft skills. I encourage you never to use those terms. Never to use those terms. Because the soft skills / transferable skills are the absolutely most challenging and difficult skills for most of us to deal with and learn. And learning is social. We've heard that in the panel before this, and we'll come back to that. I will come back to that. Meaning making and authorship. And some type of benchmark for us to be able to place ourselves and our learning in a broader context. So I come back to that question. I'm not going to show you any more slides that you actually have to read, okay? Now is the lecture part in earnest. But I'm coming back to this why. Why ePortfolio? Well, ePortfolios place the focus on learning, and they allow for multiple ways in which to present and enact learning. In formal, informal classrooms, in life outside the academy, learning brought to the academy, and learning that grows within the academy. The E of ePortfolio allows us to capture and record learning across these and other originations. It involves educators and learners in a shared dance of give and take. The point of ePortfolio is to engage educators and learners in a process of advancing learning. Learning that isn't for a grade on a test or a paper or a performance, albeit that is indeed important and motivating, but learning that is integrated into being so that it has a shelf life for years and lifetimes. ePortfolios are a means to break out of the pervasive structures we have inherited and acquiesced to that require us to organize our work within silos of departments, programs, institutions, wealth, race, gender, identities. In short, to separate ourselves, to emphasize difference, to unbundle learning. ePortfolios allow learning to be rebundled. Indeed, ePortfolio as a pedagogy, when done well, that probably applies to almost anything we do, requires users to connect their learning, to reflect on their learning, to intentionally engage with their learning as it is happening. By its nature, ePortfolio as a pedagogy cries out for integrative learning. ePortfolios also are not static. They allow for a sustainable record of learning through ongoing engagement and utilization, an ability to constantly document and experiment and develop learning through active engagement with exploration of learning as it is happening that prompts integration and connections for higher order aspects of learning. The types of cognitive, emotional, relational activities that have made recognition of ePortfolios as a high impact, highly effective practice. Not only enhancing learning, but also retention and graduation and equity. In short, ePortfolios serve a purpose of helping, indeed in actively inviting learners to create their own identities as learners and as people, their own agency as an active influencer and creator of learning, and as a person who is an educated participant in creating not only their own world, but the global environment they share. Having already perhaps become overly aspirational and idealized, ePortfolio pedagogy is not a panacea, yet it is a powerful approach. integral to our mission of enhancing learning, so that what does this mean for what we do? It's nice to talk about it, but what does it mean when we get down into what it is we do? That's about all you're going to get there, folks. Okay, no. ePortfolios are not a thing. We often speak of them in such manner. They are variously a pedagogy, a curriculum, a way of thinking, of knowing, a mindset. Borrowing from Helen Chen's folio thinking, it is a different way of conceiving and defining education. It is no longer a boxed set of knowledge for faculty to deliver, but an ecology of educators and learners and environments. Borrowing from Kathleen Yancey, ePortfolios are a curriculum, not in the constrained sense of a set of courses one takes starting with X and progressing to Y, but as the term was originally used to represent a course, i.e. a disciplined path of study intentionally developed to learn and to educate, to develop as a person, to liberate the mind. The starting point for ePortfolios is not which ePortfolio technology to adopt. It has to be what learning do we need. The ePortfolio technology does matter because the e-technology allows learning to be expanded beyond the two dimensions, to open possibilities that too often have been excluded from the curriculum. The what we need is not what we need is not what we, the faculty educator, need exclusively. Educators, of course, play an important role in pointing and guiding, but the curriculum requires room for the learner to also have voice and intentionality to achieve learning. What has recently been characterized as concerns about technology around the growing role of artificial intelligence, data collection, profiling, every move we make, and the lack of control individuals frequently have over their own digital identities, further challenges acceptance of technological solutions to educational issues. ePortfolios, however, are premised on personal control and curation of information, narrative, and presentation. The challenge higher education confronts is not so much making technology or artificial intelligence more humane, but making humans better users of technology, indeed, making humans better. Folio thinking recognized the reality of what the futurists point out: knowledge is doubling every 2 years, or as Jan indicated yesterday, more rapidly. There is no way the curriculum, especially as we have instantiated it in higher education currently, can deliver to our learners that set of knowledge. What we need is a concerted, intentional shift by educators to forefront the preparation of learners who are well equipped with skills and abilities to make sense out of knowledge and information, to make meaning of and with their knowledge for themselves and for others. Higher education educators are about making humans better through developing and instilling deep learning skills and abilities, many of them mentioned in those surveys by employers, and abilities practiced at higher order levels of complexity. Learning is relational and social in its creation and practice over time. As such, it requires responsibilities as a learner and as an educator. Learning is not passive, although we're doing that right here, you know. I didn't say I was modeling this necessarily. It is not a one-off enterprise. It is not solitary. Learning is iterative. It is work. It is questioning. And at its best, it is integrative and energizing. It is not only educators who often struggle with these concepts of learning. Many of our students, including the students we refer to as those who come to us most privileged on traditional measures of achievement, resist a shared notion of engaged learning and identity creation. How did we get here? ePortfolios have been around for decades. so we're not talking something new. I recall when Helen Barrett was bringing ePortfolios to higher education with mixed reactions. Portfolios have been in practice in higher ed, but typically were not ePortfolios. Architecture and the arts have used portfolios for a long time. The engineering accrediting body, ABET, has encouraged ePortfolio practice for a couple decades. ePortfolios emerged initially in any substantial manner in education programs, specifically teacher prep and licensure. As a result, and at the risk of offending some folks, ePortfolios were not always embraced by others in higher education because of their beginning point. Leaving aside the variable positionality of schools and departments of education in higher ed, NCATE, the education accrediting agency at the time, promoted ePortfolios in education for accreditation, i.e. accountability. Not the best way to start something new if broad acceptance and engagement is desired by educators. Even education programs did not find much of what NCATE prescribed to be very helpful or useful. Fortunately, technology developers and education as a field recognized the need to go beyond the NCATE accountability focus and evolve to better meet the needs of learning measurement support more generally. Because I am an assessment advocate and nerd, I include assessment as central to why we do anything around learning and its centrality to ePortfolio adoption. It also distresses me that higher education insists so often to justify ePortfolios for assessment purposes, typically couched in terms of accreditation and accountability reporting. The justification has resulted early on in assessment being presented in the context of an either-or, i.e. assessment of learning as compliance versus assessment for learning improvement. It's a false dichotomy, as is so often the case with our penchant in higher education to frame and beyond, to frame our work as oppositions, either-ors. Similar to the arguments above around purposes of ePortfolios generally, assessment became a strategic rationale for ePortfolio financial and resource support at institutions, rather than as a necessary aspect of support for deeper intentional learning needed for students' success. You know, I'm all for using what you need to use to get resources to support good work. So it's not casting aspersions there, but that it sets up what we do with a lot of baggage that we don't necessarily want to have with it. Okay, and so again, this either or often creates some issues for us. Again, just as the ePortfolio technology has evolved, assessment methodology and tools have also developed to more intentionally and robustly provide externally confirmed, valid, and reliable evidence applicable to all students. Perfectly blended chocolate. I like that. You've got all magic words there. Okay, this is the problem with the text. You know, then you have to find out where you left off. Okay, so it's for all students. Learning at higher order levels necessary for learners to be better equipped to recognize and respond to complex, unscripted issues that permeate modern society and life. For those of you who know me, it's not surprising that I call attention, for example, to the value rubrics in the Value Institute as robust assessment tools developed to lift up ePortfolio learning. Portfolios were indeed what our developing teams of faculty and other educators had in mind when the value rubrics were being developed as a way to begin to look at the quality of the learning our students were being exposed to as part of their journey, educational journey. ePortfolios have significant activity across the English-speaking world. EDUCAUSE has tracked the growth of ePortfolios to a point where well over half of U.S. schools of higher education appear to have ePortfolio in use on their campuses. Less systematic surveys following the designation of ePortfolios as a high-impact practice reflect a modest uptick in ePortfolio usage on U.S. campuses. The hoped-for universal adoption broadly across higher education has simply not occurred as anticipated. However, steady growth does seem to continue apace. We can anticipate continuing rapid change in technology that affects ePortfolio's future. But right now, ePortfolios are the best pedagogy we have to address learning and pedagogical improvement. As was pointed out in the panel before, over the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of change. And so ePortfolio and what we talk about as portfolios may indeed witness a substantial amount of change. So where are you? Again, I'm moving through this stuff fairly quickly. Given this picture, incomplete and cursory as it is, where is the ePortfolio community of practice and higher education as a part of the social structures expected to educate people for the future? Well, in my judgment, in a better place than we have been. Higher education educators are making, again, still too quietly, arguments for the evidence of quality education envisioned and publicly called for our students' learning, as was evidenced in those earlier slides. The need for narrative has never been more urgent. ePortfolios are particularly well-positioned to provide the visual, tangible evidence of needed quality learning to challenge fleeting, often reductionist, popular sound bites about higher education, how higher education is failing. The ePortfolio community and some accreditors and policy bodies have begun to step up in demanding institutional attention to the quality of student learning discussed above, engaging in researching the power of ePortfolios for developing and encouraging learner voice and identity as central to equity in providing quality education to all learners, systematically providing and assessing evidence of learning and effectiveness of ePortfolios in developing high-level quality learning. Higher education educators still struggle with intentionality and vision of ePortfolios as a pedagogy and a curriculum. Intentionality of action, integration of purpose, how to support educators and learners to fully benefit from the use of ePortfolios. Indeed, we still hear the refrain that ePortfolios take too much time. What if it took no time? Would ePortfolios happen? There is by default an implication that what we do now takes the right amount of time. Yet there is substantial evidence that what higher education is doing is not achieving the learning needed for success. And we hear that virtually every day. There is ample evidence that high-impact practices enhance deep learning, that unbundled, disconnected curriculum is truly limiting learning quality, that viewing learners as deficit bringers rather than asset bringers undermines learning, that even finding out about the quality of learning, i.e. assessment, takes too much time. And then to act as if continuing to do what we do and ignore this research is okay. This is no longer acceptable. Coupled with the virtual unanimity, including employers and policymakers, that higher education needs to do better, we as educators in the ePortfolio community have to lead in articulating the urgency of not settling. How do we make the case that higher education is not about preparing learners for the career of a lifetime, but rather to prepare them for a lifetime of careers? Why should we believe that if we keep doing what we have been doing, it will result in something better or different? I'm going to take a breath now and get off my soapbox. Trent, the founder, and his partner, Judy, had a vision of ePortfolio, but he also had a vision of how to generate strategies for supporting ePortfolios over time to sustain ePortfolios long enough to realize their potential. AAEEBL was that vision. He recognized that learning is a social activity. Individuals learn, but not in isolation. We learn through interactions with others, from experience, through creation of practice over time. He saw the opportunity for ePortfolio to be a way to focus the integration of knowledge, experiences, and relations in the furtherance of robust, intentional learning, identity, and creation of self that is so limited by the current modes of organizing learning in higher education. That vision is being sustained and strengthened through the ongoing AAEEBL ePortfolio community. In our collaboration with AAC&U, POD, NASPA, ACRO, the alphabet soup of acronyms, disciplinary societies, the Council of Graduate Schools, and sister organizations in Australia, in the UK, New Zealand, the European Union, and others. AAC&U will publish in January a volume on general education in the Middle East and North Africa that highlights the Islamic epistemology and its synergy with liberal learning through utilization of ePortfolio. One example of trying to bridge challenging cultural and religious divisions that our community is engaged with. The recently published guide to ePortfolio provided not only a living resource, but a vehicle, a new model for sharing engaging knowledge and expertise of a community of practice to gather from across the world resources to define and support scholarship of ePortfolio practice. The publication of the AAEEBL ePortfolio Review and the International Journal of ePortfolios, which has purposefully encouraged the expansion of research on the effects of ePortfolio on learning and practice, along with Pearl, P-E-A-R-L, the growing online repository of published research on ePortfolios. You can access it, you can Google it and access it on AAC&U's website and AAEEBL. Collaboration with EPAC, INSEPR, CRA, ePortfolio Australia, HECO, again, the alphabet soup of organizations in our world of shared community, and webinars in general on topical issues expand the community beyond the professional ePortfolio core community. In short, those of you here today, as well as colleagues who couldn't make it, are being looked to make the difference. You are the ones already engaged in whatever way you have chosen or been delegated to realize the distinct possibility that higher education can utilize ePortfolios as an effective approach to quality learning, to lift the voices of all of our students and our learners, to bridge learning in higher education, to elementary and secondary education, to graduate education, and to employment and civic life. Now is not the time to be distracted by excuses, by the few resistors who cannot value change, nor all the arguments for why ePortfolios cannot become reality for our students. This is exactly the time to stand up for the necessity of folio learning for our students, our institutions, and democratic society. I applaud each of you and encourage you to stay active in the international ePortfolio community and with your colleagues on and off campus. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it is. And the cab is supposed to be here momentarily, but presumably it won't leave without me, since I'm paying for them to be here. So we'll see. No, I would love questions. Yeah. Paul.
And actually, I would encourage you to embrace the title of elder. Having worked with Alaska, elder is more than just a function of age, but it's a recognition of what people give back to the community. You have certainly done that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kind of the vein of the last lecture, I know this is out, please say it's out. what are the things that you're seeing that you're excited about, but what are also other trends that are causing you pause or concern that you might be worried about because of what's shaping some of the other dynamics out there for higher ed?
I mean, to me, some of the biggest challenges that we're all facing, and higher education in general is facing, is how some of those things that employers talk about, and again, there's always danger in surveys and responses and stuff because wording becomes so important. And the words mean different things to different people, okay? And they talk about innovation, et cetera. And so it's translated into, well, higher education is not innovating, it's not innovating. Well, actually we are, okay? We're doing this all the time. And we're having all kinds of ways in which we're moving our work forward. ePortfolios as well. But too often it gets reduced. It's the reductionism of modern society, I think, is we need sound bites. I don't know if any of you are out there tweeting right now and stuff, but we know how Twitter can indeed reduce things to the lowest common denominator and are open perhaps to misinterpretation because we're told daily, hourly, minutely, how tweets have not actually been meant the way that they came across and stuff like that. So it's a flexibility that we need and an agility to be able to engage in narratives and indeed to take what we do and translate it into different ways in which it makes sense to other people. Tweeting is one of the ways you can do it, but it's a thoughtful tweeting, and for what purpose? And that's why I wanted to start with the purpose of what it is we're about. And it is ultimately about our students learning and the quality of that. But we do ourselves a disservice if we don't also think about how to translate it, as this panel was talking about, into other contexts and ways, and also how to resist the reductionism. And I think portfolios actually have huge potential to be able to counteract that, because it has the visual and it has the evidentiary and the relational human evidence that can be used. It used to be, we say, oh, it's just an anecdote, but it systematically has it, and we can use it to our benefit to actually provide and enhance the type of higher order learning that our students have to have if we're going to sustain. Again, I'm waxing, poetic here, I think, but the world that we want to live in. I don't know if that answers your question, but anybody else? Oh, yeah.
I think here, Joe, actually, and thanks for your talk. I'm quite excited about the movement in experiential learning and ePortfolio.
Yeah.
My question comes from a couple of perspectives. I teach first and second year university, and also I recently looked on brother to a couple of youngsters in the south of the border, in fact. And as teaching my first years, I spent quite a lot of time kind of adjusting them to university life and the types of things that, guide them towards being able to take in the outcomes we're hoping. In British Columbia, our educators are working on some significant changes in the K-12 curriculum.
Yeah, super, absolutely super.
Absolutely, and I think we'll better prepare our students. How do you feel? This is very exciting what's going on in the university and post-secondary. How is the public school system in the U.S. doing in terms of preparing for higher learning? Are you encouraged there? I'd like to think where this thinking is permeating also into the younger layers.
Wonderful, wonderful question. And yes, I'm so excited about what's happening here in British Columbia in the K-12 arena. And their efforts, as Jan talked about, of connecting it to higher education, post-secondary. There are all kinds of things happening in the lower, south of the border, where indeed ePortfolios do exist, and they're culminating experiences in various school districts and in different schools. When my kids were in school, they had to do a culminating portfolio kind of experience in order to graduate. And parents came and provided feedback on it and were engaged with it as well. But it went nowhere. At that time, higher education in that arena wasn't thinking about something other than the grades and the transcript, okay? There are efforts in New England around using it as a way to have admissions into colleges. The state of Oregon, for years, worked several years with schools and 2- and 4-year faculty in the public systems to develop the learning outcomes and the benchmarks of learning that higher education wanted in the students that they were receiving from secondary schools. And they worked it out, and they said the key to it around the time issue was that teachers are going to develop their ability to have engaged students in things that could be used to see if the students were meeting those benchmarks. Yes, to pass the course and make sure it was on the diploma, but that the learning outcomes themselves were actually being achieved at the level that was expected, and that would become part of the record as well. Okay, and that started moving. There were efforts, pilots that showed it could work, so that the teachers were doing it as part of their job of educating and interacting with their students, and the higher ed institutions could accept it because there was indeed confidence in it. And it could be externally validated and checked if there was any doubt. It required funding, though, to help teachers across the state develop this in faculty and admissions. And the legislature, as is so often the case in Oregon, hit a budget issue and pulled the funding for it. And so it just then disappeared. It's still sitting on the shelf. Could be done. It's rare. It's episodic. That's the issue. How can we help make it not episodic? Because we don't all have a ministry or whatever, as you do in British Columbia. But there are folks out there who would be open to it and stuff. We have to help our attention in higher ed become connected to and bridge to the other audiences to help support them in moving things forward too. Yeah.
On that point, what is your opinion on the role of industry in becoming the anchor which enables this to be more than episodic, whereby, for example, jurisdictions in Canada and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are saying we need this at a regional level, we need it to stop the brain drain, we need it to foster local economic development. We, that is coalitions of industry, perhaps with government reluctantly tagging along, we're going to create these sort of platforms. We're asking for these sort of ePortfolio expression, and thus we address a lot of the systemic areas within the higher education system. Do you think that kind of scenario is realistic? We're hearing some of the stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I do think it is possible. And again, that's part of that notion of how rapidly technology continues to evolve. The development of things to fill many of those gaps and provide those linkages and those bridges. I think it is going to be happening. Employers are talking about the things that we value, that they also value. Again, how can we do that translation? How can we have them? The technology is allowing companies to it's no longer necessary for our graduates, our learners, to have to move to a different place in order to get a job that fits what it is they do. The jobs can come to them increasingly, so that if you have a region where your students, your learners, your graduates are exhibiting certain kinds of things, you're going to have employers, you're going to have industry looking to there, and those folks can actually stay there and continue to contribute as if they so desire in that region, et cetera. So again, it's a technology as well as a communications and the infrastructure to support it. Again, it's always also this juggling act between cost and open source. Okay, and so we have good colleagues here who keep reminding us of what can be open source, i.e. affordable within the reach of all. But some things do come with costs. Everything we do has some type of cost to it. And so we're going to constantly have that kind of trade-off. How can we keep costs low with the benefits high? But I think employers are open to that. It's finding, again, the language and the focus of it, I think, is to keeping the focus on that quality of the learning that is necessary. Yeah, Cassandra?
So I'd love to ask thoughts about where the research and practice agenda around ePortfolio ePortfolios might be headed or could be headed in terms of equity. I could see, and we've been talking at this conference about the powerful ways in which ePortfolios open the authentic learning experience up to all of our diverse learners. In the last panel, I had a little bit of concern about language around employer fit and encouraging our students to be really authentic in who they are, when we know that implicit bias is still a part of the system, and in some cases, revealing all of that authenticity may in fact trigger some of the bias that would work against them. However, I'm sure that as a community, there are practices that we can generate that might help with that. So I'm just wondering if you're exploring those connections and where we might go.
Again, it's truly, it's back partly to your question, Paul, too. One of the issues we have to grapple with ePortfolio is this whole notion, Alexis referred to it too, is the exposure of oneself. Okay, multiple portfolios perhaps help with that. Okay, but yes, there's so much more information out there. I mean, it's like most of our students don't realize that when they do apply for a job, if anybody's interested in them, they're going to Google them. Okay, and they're going to look at that digital history. That's a huge, and I'm going to use the word danger. Okay, that doesn't, for me, say we shouldn't do things, but rather we have to be very careful how we do them, what we do, and what we encourage our students to do and to not do. There was the session that Margaret and her colleagues were doing around ethical and legal and privacy issues and stuff. Those are going to be, I think, hugely important for ePortfolio users and adoption in the future. But employers are right. They want somebody who will fit. That's actually the biggest indicator, factor in terms of whether a student stays at an institution. It's retention, graduation, is do they feel like they fit there? Okay. Quite frankly, in hiring processes, departments do that too and stuff. And yes, it opens the door to replicating what has been there rather than what the reality of our students and our populations are. But the other thing that we're also finding in nascent research right now is that it is critically important, down to the assignments that faculty give students to do, about developing our students' abilities to flatten the field in terms of those dimensions of quality, sophisticated learning, that the demographic stuff kind of disappears or gets flattened very much. It still doesn't deal with the issues of stereotype, assumptions, etc., but it allows those to be lifted up. But how do you do that appropriately in different contexts and stuff? So, no, folks, the research field is wide open. You're going to hear more about it after this from the SIGs that began those conversations. But I think the ePortfolio community is absolutely extraordinarily well positioned because it involves dealing with all of those huge issues that right now we're giving people a pass on. We're giving society, structures, industry, etc., a pass on these things for the most part. We can help control, I think, in the narrative in the conversation about that and what actually happens in terms of policy. But I think we're well positioned to do that. I am sorry, I'm going to have to run, and I really, really thank you for letting me do this stuff.
We do have a break now for about 15 minutes, and then in here for our last panel and session at 11:30. So please join me one more time.